So today in this special column, it's kind of expansion of my screenshots column because we're all still waiting for the George Jones real life movie. Don't think anybody could ever play the Possum, but we're going to talk about a very specific impact that George Jones had on my section of northern New Brunswick. For anybody that knows me, the majority of my family comes from Lorne, Gravel Hill, Jacket River, and Dalhousie region, and as we all know, it's big George Jones country up there. If anybody doesn't have a copy of the Possum's greatest hits, they're either dead or nobody talks to them. George Jones has been the unofficial voice of our section of northern New Brunswick ever since his first breakthrough with White Lightning in the late 1950s. Now, a little bit of background about George Jones. A lot of people consider him probably the most important country singer to be born in Texas in the 1930s. He was born in Saratoga, raised in Colmesville, Texas, and his early years was kind of fraught with familial problems. He lost his sister to in an early age, and his father was very abusive to his mother and to him and the rest of the children on a regular basis. But some people believe his big break came when he started singing, and he went to Jasper, Texas, and he was a regular feature on the KTXY radio station, and he also worked there as well. And for a massive coincidence, a lot of people think he's the successor to this man. Hank Williams Sr. and him met during an afternoon show where George was working. And according to his autobiography, he said he couldn't either think or eat nothing unless it was Joe Hank Williams. And I couldn't wait for his next record to come out. He had to be really the greatest. Now, if you really listen to George Jones through the years, there's a big influence of Hank on George. Now, George's other recordings had great success. He was basically kind of groomed in the old Grand Ole Opry style. But when White Lightning came out, it was considered almost like a pop rock crossover the country. He basically started the pop country movement in a kind of in a direct way. He didn't really do rockabilly, like Johnny Cash had mentioned that he wasn't really a rockabilly artist, because White Lightning actually was written by the Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson, who was a great songwriter before his passing in the Buddy Holly crash. George had claimed that when he showed up for the recording of White Lightning, he was drunk as a skunk, and it took 80 takes allegedly to record his vocals. Now, to make matters worse, one of the pickers who playing the bass on it, he had to play the bass line 80 times, even though he had some problems with his hands. Now, as it went on, he started to record most of his own songs. Now, he wrote many of his biggest hits during that first period of White Lightning to the late 1960s. The Window Up Above, big hit also for Mickey Gilley. Seasons of My Heart, Just One More, recorded by Johnny Cash, great version. Life to Go by Stonewall Jackson, later recorded. You Gotta Be My Baby, and The Color of the Blues, which has been covered by everybody from Loretta Lynn to his old pal Elvis Costello. 10 Years and Tall, Tall Trees, which was actually a big hit also for Alan Jackson. It was co-written with the great Roger Miller. Now, when Jones went over to United Artists, his biggest song, up until an infamous song we'll talk about later, was called She Thinks I Still Care. And I can't really do it justice, but for the people in Jacket River, Lorne, Beldoon, Gravel Hill, that was our first look at George's dark side. It's basically a song about a guy who may be drunk at a table or a bar and is basically saying, you know, I don't really miss her, but deep down you can see the tears in his beer, no pun intended. Now, as the years went on, the big problem for George between 64 and probably 1979 was his alcoholism. He got into drugs as well in the late 70s, early 80s, but that was not his problem. George was his own worst enemy. Drinking was his number one love besides Tammy Wynette and his widow. And he started to experiment with different sides. Like there was a kind of the Buck Owens style song with Love Bug, and The Race Is On, Things Have Gone to Pieces. He was basically a balladeer that was talking about the rural experience, the poor people, and the way people struggled with relationship and how it affected their people and their family. And that's why George was so important to people on the North Shore, because you got to remember, George Jones in 1959 was still developing. So was Northern New Brunswick. So was Restigouche. And we grew with George. Every year that George put out something new, we grew with him. And by the big problem with George, we had the relationship with his beautiful wife, ex-wife, Tammy Wynette, because when it went good, it went good. But when it went bad, it went very bad. It was a very toxic relationship. They had one child together, Tamala Georgette, but he basically had a nervous breakdown in 1970 after a drunken bender. And he went through detoxification. He was in and out of rehab in different places. And he was more sober with Tammy, but he just fell in that ball and would never come out for months. But he was still doing big hits, still doing great performances, even though he was sloshed. But there was a big change in his career. Some people consider it the greatest song of all time. I honestly think it's the greatest country song of all time. The greatest song, it would be arguable with the Beatles and different bands like that. The song was called He Stopped Loving Her Today. Came out in 1980. At the time, George had not had a number one single in 6 years. And his fans weren't writing him off, but the people in the industry were writing him off. Now, it shot the number one on the country charts, and it was there for 18 weeks. Now, the great songwriting team of Bobby Braddock and Curly Putnam tells the story of a friend who has never give up on his love. He keeps old letters and photos from back in the day and hangs on to hope that she would come back again. And what was very interesting here, there was a talking part to He Stopped Loving Her Today, which was almost a rap of sorts. Now, if you've ever been to a funeral where a close family member has died alone, or is widowed when they died, that song really resonates. And it really resonated for me because the album that was on became a big seller. The Same Old Me LP was so popular in Lorne and Gravel Hill and Jacket River, you could drive up the road in the summer, hear the start of one of the songs, hear the end of it up the road, and hear the second or third cut on your way up. Everybody was playing it. It was similar to when Elvis Presley put out his major releases in the mid to late 50s. Everybody was into George Jones. Now, this was the problem too. He was getting more success, but he was basically dying on stage. Not dying in that way you think. He literally was dying on stage. He did an infamous performance on a Ronnie Prophet show. It was a syndicated show with the Canadian multiple star, and he looked terrible. And he always said traveling in Canada was good for him because the Canadians loved him, warts and all. And that's why the connection with Northern New Brunswick and George is so strong, because we had failings back in the 70s and 80s. We're still learning to develop in our communities, going to college to improve ourselves, and we had struggles. We were sinners like George was. We made some bad decisions or had some bad pats, but we rose above. Now, George, as he continued on after his success, he kind of became a multifaceted artist. He had the famous country duet with Barbara Mandrell that was played at CMAs. But here's the thing. He started to get more radical. He was starting on hard drugs. He was getting in problems with the cops. A very famous arrest that was taped. And it was so weird. He would go on stage. I saw him in concert in Moncton, and he would go on stage and be somewhat coherent, but to get him off, it was very similar to Elvis's last few months in 77. He could perform on stage, but he was generally literally dying. But here's where Nancy showed up, Nancy Jones. Nancy was his last, and a lot of people say his best inspiration. He had a positive impact on Jones's life, and her working on George on the good aspects of the personality allowed him to be relatively sober, and it led to probably the second greatest George Jones song, called "Who's Going to Fill Their Shoes" in '85, because he claimed that his wife's inspiration of celebrating where he came from and the colleagues I had allow him to give one of the best, honest performances of his life. Now, between 1990 and his death in 2013, he had some great success with crossover songs, crossover artists. The big albums, especially Walls Can Fall in '92, and big hit Don't Need Your Rockin' Chair. But what summed up his career, there was a later hit that some people consider the prequel to We Stop Loving Her Today. It was the song Choices. Now, Choices is very important in my life because when I went blind with a diabetic seizure at a fundraising event I was covering for the Bugle in 2012, when I got better after a stay at Chalmers, I needed mental health help. The song Choices, which was a big favorite of mine a few years previously when it was released, became my mantra. Basically, the song talks about the choices you make in life, but if you make any choices, you have to look back at any choice you make as what was needed at the time. Because I've been living and dying with the choices I've made since I found out I was type 2 diabetic. I decided to continue in a media career at 70 hours a week, and it literally almost killed me. So when I see George, the success he had later, he believed that even if you have to make rough choices, you have to stand by them. And in the song talked about heavy drinking and how people who drink don't know where their path's going to end up. In my case, I made choices years ago to excel at something that nobody ever in my family excelled before, and I paid the price. But I got my vision back. A lot of people know the struggle I've been through the last few years. And actually, 2 members of my extended family asked me to look at doing a podcast on George Jones. I'm not going to say who they are because that's very private. But one of them said, George has meant a lot to us. Why don't the new channel, why don't you give a salute to George, and maybe people will catch on how important he's been to you and to Lorne and Gravel Hill and Jacket River, all the North Shore. Because you'll go to pit parties up home or house parties or events, like my good pals, Georgie Snyder, my cousin Clay LaPointe, my good cousin now departed, bless his soul, Kevin Mullally, would cover George when they could. But George, also my friend Mike Parker from Dalhousie, that's a shout out. Mike's been a performer, DJ, karaoke for years, great singer. Each person up home, every singer, every person from the North Shore has, if they're into George Jones, they have their own personal tale to tell about the Possum. And for me, I keep on seeing him on stage in 81 in Moncton. I travel on a cold bus to get down there with my old-fashioned Skidoo Parker to keep me warm. And we're coming back. And I'm freezing half to death, and I said, listen, I've been to Mecca. I've seen George Jones in concert. I thought for sure he was going to die in 1980 before he kind of, rebounded. But anyway, for anybody listening tonight, put on some George Jones songs if you're listening to it, and basically think back to a time where it's like this. Can you imagine if George Jones never existed? Would you want to live in a world with no George Jones, no Elvis Presley, no Tom Jones, no Paul Anka, all these great songwriters and performers? Anyway, if there's any members of the George Jones family listening to this, thank you for bringing the Possum to the world. And all I can say is that we all live and die with the choices we make. And in my case, he's my hero. I hope he's your hero, because it's not only me that podcasts on George over the years. There's been hundreds, thousands. And again, a world without George. Can you imagine? Have a good evening. Bye.